the topic is learning the hidden ingredient behind the data. And as you can see with our guest here, who I'll introduce in a minute, folks, but just some house rules. There will be opportunity to stick in questions. However, I have to highlight that we may not be able to answer them all. But however, there will be an opportunity further on to communicate with ourselves, myself and Jason, if you want to get those questions answered, or if you want to sort of connect with us in the future. Okay, folks, one of the things that I've really looked forward to about this is that one of the big things in sport at the minute is data. And we talk about analysis, we talk about performance analysis, we talk about all sorts of systems, we talk about the data, we talk about tactics, we talk about numbers, statistics, everything. But I think one of the things that's rarely looked at are the behaviours, is learning and behaviours under that. So with the people that we're working with. So without any further ado, I'm now going to introduce our guests. First of all, we have got Paul Treu, who is the former head coach of the South African Sevens. He's a World Series winner, folks, and someone who has, and continues to do so, rebuild cultures and systems in elite sporting environments. And I hope I did you justice there, Paul. But next, we have Darren Lewis, who is a performance analyst and an educator. He's also the former lead analyst at Gloucester Rugby, and now consultant and guest lecturing with a number of universities around the UK and Ireland within the field of performance analysis, folks. And lastly, we have Jason Lear, who's a behaviour analyst and educator, whose work blends theory, behavioural science, and the environment designed to create the conditions for performance. So, first of all, folks, welcome. How are we today? And I hope we're good. That was a question. So I'm now going to get stuck into it, folks, and I'm going to ask the first question. And as moderator, I think I'm entitled to do that. But I'm going to start with a situation. So imagine a team, they're coming off the pitch, there's a bad loss, they've got the analysis report, the video clips, KPIs, everything is crystal clear, the data, the handling errors, slow defensive resets, poor spacing. But really, the question I would want to ask is, what happens next? Does this team actually learn, or do they just watch some video clips, and does it just all happen again the next week? So does that cycle just keep happening? So let me ask each and one of you in one sentence. Well, because I'm kind, I'll allow maybe a couple. What tells you that an athlete and team is genuinely learning rather than just reviewing the information? And Paul, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks, Darren. Terence. Yeah, I think I've been involved in rugby for a number of years, and I've been across the various continents and consulting with teams, and what I've noticed, and even with the university team that I'm coaching at the moment, is when players are feeling safe, when you create an environment where there is safety and people can feel that they can make mistakes, they tend to excel. And I think that is what I've noticed in my over 20 years as a coach, coaching at elite level, and even now coaching at the lower level, is that when players are feeling safe, when you allow them to make mistakes, when they're learning faster, when they're taking ownership over their own learning, that is when you know that the team is learning. And quite often you see, like, when you step into a team meeting room, when you step onto the field and the coach is talking 70 or 80% of the time, no learning is happening. And I think, when players are starting to become more vocal, when they're starting to take ownership over their own learning, that is when the real learning takes place. And that's when I saw, that there was a big difference in terms of performance and outcome.
So, excellent, Paul. Thank you very much for that. Darren, can I ask you the same question?
Yeah, thanks, Terence. Definitely resonate with some of the things that Paul's saying there. I think it's really hard to summarize in one or two or three sentences because learning's so multifaceted and so contextual. But I think when people and teams are beginning to learn, because you can see this gradual shift in behaviors towards any kind of intended aims. those things might not necessarily show through, drastic differences statistically or even in terms of outcomes, but you can start to see collective behaviors coming through based on practice, based on reviews and kind of information sharing. So that's kind of what I would kind of add on to what Paul's kind of shared there is, a collective understanding and behaviors nudging towards your intended aims and performance models.
Thank you very much for that, Darren, and we'll unpack some of it in a bit. But Jason, can I ask you the same question just to finish off from that question, please?
Yeah, for me, I think looking at it purely from that educational concept of actual learning, without any nuances of what learning really is, I think it's when you can take what you practice and apply that in a real world situation. Not only, like, I don't just mean able to apply it, but the reality is that you've learned something when you can apply it in a real world environment, but under pressure. That you can actually take it and you can execute that learning in the natural world, but like I say, under pressure and in different situations. And that for me is how you measure learning, that it can be applied.
Okay, so folks, just for at home there, just to sort of put a little collective spin on that. So from Paul, we really got it's about ownership. If we can transfer that ownership and where the players essentially become self-sufficient, that essentially, Paul, and correct me if I'm wrong here, where you've done your job so well that you've more or less made your job redundant in the same sort of sentence, that the players are just taking that the facilitation that you're doing and they've taken that and now they're applying it themselves and they're driving everything, more or less everything, with you just keeping the boat steering in the right direction. Would it be right there?
Yes, you're spot on, Terence. And I think, I want to latch on maybe to what Jason also said. And we brought in a policy even with our university team at the moment where players always speak first. And I think, in testing whether players are whether they can apply whatever you're trying to coach within that pressure situations that Jason is talking about. How are we going to know if the players are not going to, start talking about those scenarios, if they can verbalize their understanding of what is required and what needs to be applied? And even this past week, we had very interesting, discussions with some of our players where they were making repeated, mistakes. And so then we were asking, but the thing is that it's not a player problem, it's a coaching problem because we are not creating the correct environment where the players are putting under enough pressure, to limit the time and space so that they can get used to how to execute under the same conditions when it comes to the games in training. And this is a big lesson because we have very young coaches coming into our environment. And we constantly have to remind ourselves that if we want the players to play under to train under the right conditions so that we can excel the learning experience, we need to create the conditions for them, that is very similar to a game. So definitely, if we can quantify that learning and like Jason said, whether they can apply, whatever we're coaching, with under pressure and, then we know to a degree, at least, they will have the ability to transfer that into a game situation.
Okay, Paul, I'm going to hold that there for you because I'm going to ask you a question now. And Darren and Jason, I'm going to really put a bit of pressure on you as well because the context will be slightly different because of your roles. So we're talking about the environment here, folks. So Paul, in sport, you can have the same athletes, the same systems, even the same data. Some of your athletes raise, some hesitate, some shut down completely. So essentially, we're getting different reactions from the players. So I'm opening this up to you, Paul, but I'm going to open this question up to all three of you as well. And Jason and Paul, or Darren, you'll be looking at this from a different context, I'm hoping, from Paul because of their roles. So Paul, you've been in some of the most intense performance environments in the world. How do you think that environment itself either elevates performance far beyond what the data has predicted, or does it completely suffocate despite the numbers suggesting the game should have resulted differently? Really, in other words, when did you win or lose against the data, and why do you think that was?
Yeah, Terence, we actually we did a study after one of, obviously in sevens you play a World Series, and you back in the day, we had 12 tournaments starting in December or November, and you play right up until maybe May, June the following year. And what we found was when we did well, our physical load was low, our intensity was high, and our learning was extremely high. And when we actually had our worst performance, it was the other way around. We had high physical load, low intensity, and low learning. And I think there was a big eye opener for us in terms of you can have the best data in the world, but if you're not going to treat your training field and your learning environment as a classroom, and the players are learning very fast, then you're probably not going to meet the goals that you would like to achieve. So to answer your question, where I've seen success, within my environment, as a coach, is where the learning was extremely high. We didn't do a lot on the training field, but we know that there was transfer, that we know that there was ownership, and the players, the speed at which they learn was extremely high.
Well, fascinating answer, Paul. And you know what? I have about a million questions I want to ask you. However, it's not about me. But so I'm actually going to pass it to Darren. And Darren, the reason I was saying that you and Jason will look at this as a different context, you'll have more similar context but you've stepped out of elite sport now, and now you spend more time in a consultancy role around education, working with the teams and organization, and really, to an extent, you're from the outside looking in. So, would your answer to that question be any different from Paul?
I think Paul said some stuff. I've got a million questions to ask him about. um, really, again, just to kind of jump on, quite often it's not what we say, it's what the people we're delivering to hear, what they experience. So we have to be so intentional about how we shape our environment during practice, away from practice, the things we say, the things that we kind of communicate and share with our players or our audience. So yeah, I just think that's a really kind of profound insight for people to think about in your own environments. Um, you'd mentioned about good data and things like that, and I think good data is a really interesting phrase because, again, it's so contextual to so many different things. Um, but your data has to be closely linked to your game model. It has to have a purpose. It has to serve your team. Otherwise, we end up drowning in useless numbers. Um, so, I think the best environments really are intentional with their use of data and their collection of data. And I can remember periods with the teams I've worked with where we actually wouldn't present any data some weeks. In fact, most weeks we avoided presenting data because we valued understanding over other kind of facets of the game. And the data was really a coaching tool that supported various decision making or highlighted some areas that potentially we need to focus on. But this idea of data being the driver, I think, is kind of false. And actually, it's just one tool in the box. And the good environments kind of view data as one piece of the puzzle, and they contextualize it really, really well. So actually, when you do deliver something statistical to a group, it has a massive impact because you're able to translate it into something that a player is going to be able to take that information point put their boots on and go and deliver something based off of that piece of information or data point. So yeah, I suppose, the pressure thing always kind of comes to everyone in sport. But I think the best environments really contextualize data well and have a really good purpose for its use.
And Darren, just while I've got you there, just as you from your current role, especially you being a former practitioner in with the team, uh, would you see like huge differences in the way, like we all work with data, but when we talk about, have you any good examples of where you can see different practitioners that you're working with maybe working more towards behavior rather than just data? Like we're in a data like driven world, as you said there, use the term. But have you any good examples of where you've seen a difference between all the practitioners, all the educational institutions that you work with?
Yeah, I think we all do it. I think we all do it, and I think data is just it has a sphere of influence, doesn't it? You know, some people utilize data more than others. Um, Even if you think about some of the all or nothing video series, you know, you see video sessions with the coaches, and they're not talking about data or numbers. They're talking about behaviour understandings for game model or principle based kind of topics. Um, and you know, we do see lots of use of data. I suppose one thing that jumps to mind is the last rugby project I worked on with a team in the States. We actually made a conscious decision not to collect any data for a season, um, because we valued understanding over data. And you know, to go on the back of what Paul said, that actually reduced a lot of anxiety around the use of analysis and video. You know, no one was going to walk into one of our intelligence sessions because they were going to have their tackle success thrown up at them. You know, what we were going to do was debate and discuss and reflect on various decision makings, and I suppose what I would call the bringing to life of your game model. Um, but yeah, I do think that lots of people do look at behavioral things. It's just whether the data has a sphere of influence on what they look at, I suppose.
Holy goodness. You know, Paul, Darren, I might need you to stay on. I know we've only an hour here, but listen, I don't know how many hours ahead or behind you are, Paul, but I'll definitely come back to that myself. But now, Jason, I'm going to bring you in because I want you to look at this from a behavioural lens to tie this together, what Paul and Darren have just told us, and they've told us quite a lot. So, can you tell us what the evidence, what would it tell us about these environments, and why the same information produces completely different outcomes depending on behaviours, norms, and just the learning climate around it, if that makes
Eh,
sense?
yeah. I think the easiest way to contextualize this is to come away from sport for just a second and point to a researcher by the name of Amy Edmondson. And Amy done some, I suppose, but pioneering work in the sense of what she found. And she was working in the medical profession, had gone into hospitals, and what she was trying to identify was high performing teams, and why there was differentiation between high performance and perceived poor performance. And going into that medical environment, she looked at it from a patient outcome. So what teams were having better patient outcomes against the teams that were having less favorable patient outcomes. And because the teams stayed reasonably consistent, you know, they don't change that often, that she'd gone into doing a study and an analysis. And one of the first things they thought, easiest way to identify this is let's count their mistakes. Let's look at what mistakes they're making and the type of mistakes that they're making. And that's going to tell us an awful lot of information. And they got shortly into the um, study, and everything was threw on his head, because what they identified very, very quickly was the high performing teams were making more mistakes than the less favorable outcome based teams. So the teams that needed more development weren't performing as well, were at this stage of the study making less mistakes. And that was a head scratching moment for the research team. So they then dug a bit deeper, and they found out that actually wasn't the case. The case was the high performing teams were reporting more, the poor performing teams. So the environment that they were working in was very different to the environment of the high performing teams. Because who's worked in a bit? I'm sure if there's people in the audience here, who's worked in a business that has multiple departments, and you walk into one room and it's buzzing, it's electric, it's really, oh, I love being in here. And then you walk into another apartment and it's deadly silent. And I always, one of the things that I talk about when I'm in training programs and teaching people about behaviors and stuff, I always say that silence is the byproduct of fear. If you have a quiet environment, people are afraid to say things, to challenge each other. And that's what she was finding in the study, that the culture within management and leadership was the difference, that the environment. So, you know, when we talk about environment, we're not talking just simply about the walls and the bricks and mortar and tools that we have. We're talking about the people, the culture. the entire environment and what's that climate like in there for people to challenge each other. And that study was then plugged into Project Aristotle of Google and things like that, and it found out huge things. So like when you get into that area, you do realize, and I'm in the middle of writing a book, and the book is called The Environment Wins. That's literally the title, because I honestly believe I could take a high performing group of people and put them in a bad environment and outperform them with a poorer group performance level, but in a better environment, just simply because of creating in those conditions. So to me, the environment's always going to be the winner, and how you build those is through, it's what these guys are talking about. It's through those conversations. It's like making decisions like that about data. We don't want them unintended consequences of data impacting our environment and things like that. So, I think what the guys are saying, there's clues there in why they're working in high performance environments. The clues are in, listen to what they're saying, those wee clues that they're telling us about what those environments look like.
Okay. Well, Jason, coming from that, and we're going to stay on environments, but now I feel much better about being a poor athlete. Because looking back at my own performances over the years, I just think the environment was really poor. Although I wasn't reporting it, I was showing it. But anyway, that's another story for another day. But can we stay there on environments, if that's possible, fellas? Because I want to come away from data and just see and decide, like, if teams actually improve. So across the elite sport, we'll say an elite sport here, everyone has the same technology, same GPS, same video tracking systems, wellness scores. They've got a lot of different departments throwing a lot of the same things, and a lot of teams across elite sport, across different sports, have the same technology, same access, essentially, to everything. But I suppose it's the impact of these tools that the way they use them massively depends on what their environment actually allows. So, Paul, just you've been inside environments where the pressure's intense and learning has to happen quickly. You maybe don't have as much time as you like, but can you share your own thinking around the environment itself? And has that changed your thinking in any way over the course of your career?
Yeah, I think I only came across Jason's part, this past year, past couple of months, and one thing that I took, from what Jason presented also earlier, to our coaches was what he calls that time to power ratio, and what kind of impact, as a coach are you making within your environment. Jason is also talking about, the cost to power ratios, the things that you don't do, that you don't focus on. And even just today, I mean, I was like reviewing, our training of yesterday, and I wasn't with our back line at the time. I was mostly with the forwards, and the training was about 15 minutes long. But the coach was talking most of the time. The coach was running everything. The coach was even, at one point, Darren, the coach was at fly off, and he was demonstrating, what he would like, the players to execute. And it's a discussion that we're obviously going to have as a coaching group. That when we talk about an environment, what kind of environment are we creating? And is it self-learning? Is it something where people are taking ownership over their own learning? But yeah, I think their time to power ratio is really important, and I think what kind of impact are you making within your own environment as a coach. In sevens, you have like 42 minutes, maybe sometimes you have a bit more if you go all the way to the final. And what's your time to power ratio within 42 minutes? Before we won our first World Series tournament, we lost to England by over 100 points over 3 games. That's 42 minutes. I mean, and that's insane. And we had to change, certain things. We trained hard. We had all the data. We were one of the fittest teams, but just something just didn't click. So what had to change? It was the speed at which we learned. It was our behaviors that had to challenge, that we had to challenge. And, and from then on, obviously there are a lot more, like Darren said, a lot more contextual factors, a lot of cultural things that had to change. Bring in the right people, obviously within your environment. But it is how we actually started to select our players was not based on how good players were, but how fast they were actually learning, how quick they could change their own behaviors, and how quick they could fit into our own team environment. And when players start to to, to almost like, challenge each other and start to create that entry and the criteria that you used for players to come into your environment, then you're on a good wicket, that you're really on a good path and on that trajectory towards success, because players then decide themselves what is the level of standard that you're setting for yourself as a player and as a team, and who are those players that will be allowed to come into the environment that is going to meet those standards and even excel. And I think, when we're talking about the time to power ratio, it is really about, what kind of standards are you setting for yourself. And when the players are holding each other accountable to those standards, then you know that you're in good space as a team.
Paul, thank you very much for that. And not the sort of telltale, but when you said about the 100-point loss over 3 games, I did see a smirk from Darren. I don't know, maybe his mouth happened to move at the same time. However, Darren, while we're on the cusp of you, can I throw that same question at you? Because your answer hopefully will differ from Paul's, because Paul took that ecological environment of a severe loss to the English, and from then he had to then change something, and it was about that journey of finding out what it was and doing something about it. But one of the things that I hear, that a word that I heard often, was standards. So obviously you get the answer to this question, but how important are standards to the environment?
Yeah, I think standards are really important. But I think they have to be really early on when you're actually starting to build your version of an environment. And quite often we have to unpack and rebuild certain things from an environmental perspective. But we also need to be really transparent about those. Expectations from playing groups, what are players' expectations of coaches, and performance staff. And especially when it comes to things like analysis and data, we have to be really transparent about how we use those tools, um, the benefit to get from where we are to where we want to be. So yes, that standards are obviously really important, but they have to be, again, aligned with within an organization. I don't think they can be just delivered from a coaching group to a playing group and vice versa. They have to be kind of pre-agreed. So yeah.
And have you found it, Darren, just staying with you, I just want to get a bit more from you when it comes to the environment, because I'm sure going out on your own in a consultancy role, you're probably walking in to many different environments across many different sports. Like, is there anything that stands out, or is there any familiarities that you think that apply? So, if an environment, this is why the environment is good, or does anyone even ask or tell you about the environment? Is it even brought up?
That's a really good question. They're things that I always try to get out of people in different ways. I'm always really curious about how people will implement their video analysis, how people present, what sort of strategies are they designing to kind of really create a good learning intervention, or a really kind of sticky message for their players, or their athletes. Again, it's just so contextual though. I work with ice hockey teams who have 3 games in a week. So their capacity to play, review, adjust, no practice time, we just play again. Things like that have become really kind of interesting to me. And, I spoke to a hockey coach a while ago now, and they delivered um, opponent information an hour before the first puck drop, before the puck dropped. So not only do the players have to absorb new information, potentially make a tactical shift, they're also in the physical state of, oh, I need to go and perform now. So they're juggling all these different kinds of feelings and performance anxieties and new information to act on. So there's lots of things I think we can learn from, different environments, how we prime players, how we give people enough time to absorb information before they have to act on it. So again, it's just so contextually different. My world as an analyst, We played 1 week. We had a week to debrief, a week to understand and unpack before we started to build back up again into the next game. Again, you know, in Paul's environment, you play one game, you come off the pitch, you're probably playing again in an hour's time. So, you know, your capacity to absorb new information is probably restricted. And, you know, I'd love to know how Paul managed those situations. But you have to unpack the environment before you start designing interventions that kind of can have an impact, I think.
It's really interesting. And Jason, I'm actually going to bring you in on this because Paul and Darren have just told me about they're faced with Paul directly and Darren coming in, working in environments like you give the ice hockey example there. There's no time essentially to practice or adjust. Essentially, it's game after game, and like I suppose it shows that if the environment is bad, then that can make those types of situations more nasty. And we heard about Paul having, albeit lost to England, that he knew he had to do something, and it was probably a bit more than the data. It was something larger in itself, and I did take standards. And obviously, it's easy to assume that we all set standards, but it just shows you that we all have a different assumption of what good standards are. But when we're talking about environments, Jason, from the evidence base, how important is the environment to the metrics and the data, and how much do they change people in the terms of how they think and feel? And essentially, like, so for example, two people could look at the same number. One would be fearful, and one could be potentially more motivated, or is that even the case?
Context will always matter. So, like, when I say context, is again the environment that you're in and how people have obtained feedback in the past from that type of data. So, like, you know, if they create relationships between numbers and selection and things like that, they start to make up these own patterns in their head. What you start to have is these things called like establishing operations of motivation. So as a person, what's the best way? So there's like a value altering effect and a behavior altering effect of something, right? And what I mean by that is, let's just say that you have a player and you're asking him to hold some width on the wing. So you're saying, look, today you're taking on a tactical role. We want to play a wide game, so I need you to keep the opposition wide. So I need you to stay out on the wing. But this player over time has anchored contact with the ball as a way of getting selected, right? So that's the way we've been presenting over the last couple of months. Get some time on the ball, guys, and he's noticing a pattern. The value of the ball is much greater to him at this stage because of the way we've been working with the context of those metrics before. So you start to get this unintended consequences starting to evolve. And what I mean by that is that he's out on the wing and he's starved of the ball. So the value of the ball is starting to be altered in his head. My coach isn't seeing me. I'm stood out here doing nothing. I need to get in there. I need the coach to see me. I want to be picked next week. So because the value of the ball's changing, his behavior then starts to change and that he drifts towards the ball. You know what I mean? So players will come out of position because they think the metric is the measure with which. So it comes down to context. If we're not very careful with how we present data and who we're presenting it to, it's like GPS data. To me, GPS data is hugely valuable to your S&C coaches. Your players don't really need to be seeing it. You know what I mean? It's who's the people that are using it to condition? Who's the people? Because what you don't want is players thinking, Johnny runs 7 miles this week in a game. I'm going to beat him next game. I don't care if you run 4 miles. If you do your job, it's, you know what I mean? So it's about conserving energy. So it's about when we're presenting this data and who's getting access to the data, the context matters so much. Because if players start seeing figures and making up their own ideas of how valuable that is to their coaches, you start to have these altering effects in your behavior. So it establishes a motivation for you, and like the value of things change. So then naturally your behavior will drift towards what you think is valuable. And look, that in the context that I'm saying that is much more prevalent at lower levels of sport than the higher you go up the chain. Players have become more accustomed, like at elite level, it's about fine-tuning this, not presenting everything. These guys, you know, and women playing at that level have already been conditioned in certain ways to perform at such high levels. But down at those lower levels, if we can get this information into our players at a much younger age and understand why do I want to drift in there? It's not that he shouldn't drift in there, because we don't want to create robots either. It's that he makes the right decision. He's drifting in there because it's a clear option for our team to open up an opposition or do something, not because I want the ball. And
It's sorry, Jay, it's funny because you know I go and watch my son play football on Saturdays, and you can hear the coaches shouting, get wide," and then you see the kids go and stand on the white lines. Not that wide, not that wide, you know, and
yeah,
it's not what we say, it's what gets heard.
yeah,
And it's so important, you know, when we're working with data and video and we're presenting our analysis, you know, if I could go back, I would make sure at the start of every season I would run a session with the players and coaches and have more of an explanation about this is what we're doing, this is how we intend to use it, this is the purpose behind it. So you have to bring people in. If you keep people on the periphery, they're going to be anxious about it, not sure about it, and then you don't establish a level of buy-in that you potentially need for them to make a behavioral change.
yeah.
Sorry, yeah, it just made me.
No.
No,
That's, I think you've closed that off lovely. It's that concept of, you know, these kids, what's valuable to me, and if they don't understand the true value to the coach and what the coach is trying to achieve, and you know, it's the not knowing. And I think when I talked about that environment earlier, it's about that shared information. It's about, you know, safe environments don't mean these cuddly, hugging environments. It's not soft. It's not soft. You know, Popovich, one of the greatest coaches in basketball, was a traditional hard coach. He had unbelievable outcomes, but he created a safe environment to challenge each other. You know, players could challenge what he was saying, the same as vice versa. And that's what it's about. It's not that we run around being all sort of soft with our approaches. It's about accountability, challenging people, but also good information sources and good communication throughout that.
you know, Jason, just and Darren, I actually really liked your example there, especially applied to a very basic setting of children's football, like albeit your son, and definitely different from the environments that you and Paul are probably working in children's football, but I'm sure there's still pressure there somewhere. And while we're on the topic of pressure, and Jason, you talked about context is so important, which is great, but I want to stay with pressure. Say, because Paul and Darren, you give me two great examples. One about England, and Darren used the ice hockey example, and it's really stuck with me about pressure in elite environments. Like we've all been there, every coach, player, analyst, they would know certain factors. Like for example, in a match, final few minutes of the game could be 10 minutes. Crowd scoreboard's tight, crowd are going mad. Pace of the match is probably slowed down, although players probably would disagree. It's probably when players are more fatigued, decision making would probably narrow, people stop scanning, communication shortens maybe, and maybe then players fall back on the habits that have been built, whether they're either good or bad, that's not for me to say. So essentially, my point is either the learning that they have sort of ingrained themselves either shows up or completely disappears. So what I want, and I'm going to reverse the questions here. Jason, I'm going to start with you. Essentially, the question I want to ask is, how does pressure affect the ability to apply what a team has actually learned?
I, from my perspective, I'm not going to answer this in the context of players and things like that, and what we think a game situation creates. I'm going to look at this simply from like the way we absorb information. So there's research as far back as the 60s. Atkinson and Sweller had worked out this concept of the working memory. You know, that it's tiny, like think of your working memory like a desk, and your system two, as Daniel Kahneman put it, your reflective memory, your big part of the brain is like a warehouse. So on this desk, we can only get so much information. And what they noticed was that our working memory holds a lot of unfinished stuff, right? In the sense that we hold on to things we haven't done. And it's a simple example of this is how many people maybe have forgot to send an email, and how many times that plays over in your head during the day. It's taking up cognitive load. So that starts happening. So in a match situation, mistakes and things can start to take up parts of this working memory, right? So this load is building up on you. And then John Sweller had done some research in the 80s, and what he had worked out was if you fill people's working memory up, their performance nosedives, their learning ability nosedive, all these performance levels drop. And what does that mean really in a lot of environments? Well, it's how we manage that load. Now, you go into most environments and like you think of pilots, you think of the medical profession, you think of military, they use checklists an awful lot. And those checklists are not designed purely from a safety point of view. They're designed to allow a captain to make decisions in high cognitive load environments. So if you think of Sullenberger landing the plane on the Hudson, you know, whenever they went Mayday, 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 the first thing Styles is co-pilot does is go for the QRF, quick reference guide, pull it up, starts to go down a checklist. The reason that checklist is there is to remove the cognitive load, that he's not thinking about the checklist, he's just following it. So the decisions, the bigger decisions can be made from that reflective memory. So you start to stitch this in. So your behaviors are being controlled by what you can manage within. What does that mean? Can we run around with a checklist on a rugby pitch or a football pitch? Under no chance, no circumstances. Have you done this? Have you done that? So what we have to do is find ways of exposing people to this cognitive load more often in training, in situations and things like that. So you think of pilots, they spend an awful lot of time in the simulator, and when they get their driving licenses, I call it, they don't go into the simulator to learn how to fly. They go into the simulator to deal with crises, expose them to situations, high intensity situations, pressure situations. So they're learning how to manage the cognitive load. And I think that's what we see, maybe a big difference at elite level and lower levels as well, that this happens much more often, you know, in training situations and things. They will look to put a higher level of load, create high intensity within training. Whereas at the lower levels, it becomes very much around technical skill. But we can add in those loads at an earlier level to develop the brain. And it was a coach, I can't remember his name, years ago, when I read some stuff on him. Michel Brunix, was it? Used to make the players count when he was doing passing. I think he was a Belgian or a French coach. And he used to like shout 6 + 4, and they had to answer whatever. So it was about building that brain capacity. So they were doing two things at once, and it was those sorts of things that he reckoned developed some player intelligence. And I think he has some brilliant outcomes out of his. I think it's Michel Brunix, I think was the name of the coach. And I remember reading stuff, and that was what got me intrigued around developing. How do you develop players' pressure mind? Because we can all do it under no pressure. We can all kick a ball. We can all, but once the pressure, when there's another player standing in front of you, you know, what's Mike Tyson say? Everybody's hard until they get a smack in the mouth. You know what I mean? It's that scenario when somebody stood in front of you. Can you still do it? Can you still defend yourself? Can you still execute the skills?
Well, it's one of those things. It's everyone has a plan, Jason, until they're punched in the face. I think it's now when I say, and listen, I wouldn't like to be hit by Mike Tyson or anyone for that matter. But Darren, Jason was talking there about like the pressure environment, and one of the things he said about cognitive load. I'm not going to ask you directly about cognitive load, but what I'm going to ask you as a former like practitioner with a team, a elite team, and now is your role as a consultant under pressure. So when you see pressure in the environments now you're in, so on the field or the ice at the rink, do you see changes in data? And which I think will obviously be yes, but if so, what does that reveal to you personally about the team's ability to learn?
I mean, you know, such a good question, because actually I think it's really hard to kind of establish things like that, you know, in terms of what people have and haven't learned, you know. And again, this whole concept of learning is so multifactorial. Um, are we happy, you know, do we consider learning that someone sat in one of our video sessions and they can remember what we said as a minimum? You know, are we considering that as learning? Or do we consider learning as them being able to action what we've said? You know, that there's so many ways to kind of unpack that. I think the pressure thing again comes back to kind of I feel it comes back to kind of what I mentioned earlier. Are we seeing people's behaviors nudge towards our intended aims? Are we seeing them attempt to get closer to have better spacing, better line speed, pick up defensive cues, stand not as wide on the touchline? I think that would constitute kind of a really positive learning outcome, should I say? But Paul alluded it to already. Do we expose our players to the right types of pressure environments in practice where they can have an opportunity to emit the right behaviours or a desired response? So and then we chuck the data thing in there. Does that influence our data? Well, that would depend on what you collect. I would say that behaviors probably often don't have an influence on big data points, but they probably have an influence on types of performance outcomes. Being in the right position but not getting the ball. That's a really positive outcome for someone who's been in the wrong position for the last 5 weeks, but potentially he doesn't get a metric or a tick in the box for that publicly or statistically. And again, Jason's already touched on it. We can sit and watch video with our heartbeats at 80 BPM. We've got a coffee, and it's okay. Yeah, I know I'm in the right place here. That's fine. But in the last 10 minutes of the game, when the score's tied, that's a very, very different circumstance and an environment for someone to be in. And the pressure's physical, it's cognitive, it's anxiety, it's pressure. Are they going to remember what was on the slide at the beginning of the start of the week? I'm not sure. So it takes time to build these behaviors to kind of do well in the back end of performances. So I've danced around the question there a little bit.
No, you've done actually, Darren. You know what? Because I'm going to hold you there because it's actually quite interesting. Because you said Jason talked about the cognitive load, that pressure, and you've talked about there. You mentioned that it takes an awful lot of time to build those behaviors. So, Paul, obviously, I would agree with that. I'm hoping you would agree. It would take an awful long time to build those positive behaviors. But have you ever been in a situation where you felt you've done that you've worked with your athletes and then you've just seen the pressure strip away everything that you've worked on? And have you ever thought, probably maybe left scratching your head, question yourself as a coach about how to overcome this now when you've probably felt you've done your work?
Yeah, so I think that was the start of our preseason, because we are currently within our preseason for our university competition for next year. And that's exactly the kind of questions that we've asked ourselves. What are the most frustrating things that we saying to each other when the players are playing the game? What are the things that we coached that they struggle with? It's in a lineout. The players can't, ID the space. They can't remember their calls in the lineout. They can't remember their systems. So what are the most frustrating parts, in coaching that you feel like that you've coached it, the players should know it, but they're not executing it in a game? I mean, we've all been there. And this was a very interesting chat that we had with the coaches because and after Jason also worked, with our coaches, over a number of weeks, and we started to realize and started to ask different questions, from each other. So we are saying that the players should know this. They should know the play. They should know the call. But you can't measure knowing. So we assume that the players, should know what is supposed to happen, how they, supposed to execute things in the game. But if we're not going to make things measurable, in training, then it's going to be very difficult, for them, to remember these kind of things in the game. So I want to take a step back and I want to talk about two things, that's going to touch on what Jason also spoke about and what Darren also spoke about. So we're going to use our preseason now almost like as a case study. And the first thing that we did is to show them, Jason, the Bloom's taxonomy and the level of thinking that is applied, in learning. And we had to do that, in order for them to understand that for them to know a play is the lowest level of thinking. We don't require them to be rocket scientists. We don't require them, to think outside the box. All that we want them to do is to know and to remember and understand a play or something that we're trying to coach. So that's the lowest. But if we really want to be, successful, if we really want to become a high performance team or an elite team and aspire to win, our competition, then we have to start moving into applying what we learn. We have to start moving into evaluating, new things, innovating, creating, those are the highest level thinking, space that we need to move into. So, and I think we had to create that kind of awareness first so that the players can understand, but we're actually operating at the lowest level and we're never going to be, be successful as a team unless we're going to start to remember and understand and then to start to apply it, within those pressure situations in the game. And what Jason spoke about, the system 1 and the system 2 thinking, and that's also the awareness that we had to create. So when we talk to our players, we talk about, the principle of effectiveness. For example, when you're close to the ball, when you're forward and the 9 pass to the forward and there's 0.5 meter space and 0.5 seconds, that is going to be a different, kind of pressure that you're going to be under, versus a backline player or maybe a loose forward that's in a wider channel who's got maybe 3 or 4 seconds maybe to execute or to move into space. So once the players start to understand what is the context and what is the window to override and what is required for them to be consistent, within that level of pressure, then they also start to adapt to things a little bit quicker. And then it's up to us as coaches, to create the environment and our activities that is going to apply that consistent pressure, in training so they can get used to those environments.
It's going to take, and you know what, Paul, I'm actually going to stay with you for me because now, and I'm actually, so get ready, Paul and Darren, I'm going to put you on the spot here because I'm doing this for the sake of the audience, because what you've just described there to me is, well, first of all, wow, the pre-season as a case study, taking that, and it's actually a bit fascinating to hear you talking about the work that you've taken from Jason. I know I'm aware of Bloom's taxonomy, or I'm talking about the fact that you've tried to, I'm talking about the fact that you've tried to apply what you've learned.
Sorry, Dan,
So
are you asking me that question? Or sorry, I just
no,
lost.
no, sorry, I'm now going to ask you the question. So apologies. In your opinion, what talking about feedback now? What does an effective learning actually look like in practice, and what gets in the way of it?
I think this is what we've started now with our players also is we found that our players are very quiet, and I think Jason also spoke about it. When you walk into an environment, is it very quiet? Is it very vocal? And like I said, we would like to use this season, maybe in preseason, as a case study, and to see, what are the things that we can do differently in terms of feedback. And what we've started now to do is within our team meetings are really becoming a classroom. And, where we used to, put up the video clips and explain a lot of things and discuss, tactics, we first now start to go into smaller groups and we start to, tap into peer learning, and we tap into, small group meetings, and the players have to give feedback on their learning experience. And I think hopefully over time, we're going to see a different, kind of learning experience. And when Jason is talking about, what is the optimal learning experience that we can create, I think that is probably one of the tools that we're going to use as the season progresses and over the next couple of weeks to see, if the learning is going to stick, if the things that we're trying to coach, the players are going to remember, and will they be able to apply whatever we've learned, to the games. So that I think, we're probably going to start tapping into more tools to see how can we integrate feedback into our training design, our training plan. So how can we use scaffolding? How can we start, our training? How can we build the feedback within our training as we go, maybe in a 90, minute block? So if there's 4 minutes, what's going to happen after the 4 minutes? Are we going to set outcomes for the players that they need to achieve, something that's measurable? and at the end of the practice, how are we gonna, get feedback from the players again. So these are the kind of things that we're spending more time on now. It is not, yes, the tactical and the technical detail is very important, but it's more like how are we gonna know whether our players learned or not? That is probably a more important question for us than anything else, as opposed to what to do and what to coach, is that whether our players learned or not. And I think because if they didn't learn, we can coach until we're blue in the face. They know they won't be able to transfer. They won't be able to remember their calls. They won't be able to apply whatever we're trying to coach. So I think we are shifting our focus in understanding whether learning took place and whether there's a behavior change if we feel like something is not changing. So I would say that's probably the most important thing for us at the moment, is to see how can we design our meetings, how can we design our activities on the field, to get more feedback from the players.
And just quickly staying on that, Paul, what gets in the way of that? What would stop you from doing that as a coaching team?
What will stop us from doing it?
Yeah.
I think it's our own, we expect our players to learn faster. And I think, is we will have to keep exposing our coaching staff and our broader backroom staff, to the principles of learning. And I think, having webinars like this and exposing them to other opportunities where our staff can learn, I think, it's going to be a continuous process, and that's the only way that I can see maybe within our environment is not just for me maybe to come and to speak most of the time, but it's for our coaches to present. We had an example now last week where one of our coaches actually did his first presentation to the team. That in itself is a big win for us, and even like yesterday's practice that I reviewed today, where the coach was doing most of the work. And for 50 minutes, we actually didn't achieve, the things that we wanted to achieve. So those are the things. So what we've created is we just call it like a 5-minute feedback that the players have to do. So after every training, coaches must submit their feedback on the training, and there are a few things that they need to add. So one is they need to add their plan for the training. They need to add their learning outcome. They need to add the level of Bloom's taxonomy that they wanted to apply within their practice. So did you target, understanding? Did you target to remember, for the players to remember something, to apply something, to innovate and come up with new ideas? And what is your confidence level on a scale from 1 to 10 that you feel that the players actually achieved that learning outcome? And this is now becoming so interesting, because now us as coaches, we're starting to talk about coaching differently. But because we're not talking about what we did, we're actually talking about, did the players learn or not?
Paul, that's really fascinating. Like, you're really holding yourself and your coaching team to account. And essentially, I don't want to say use a negative advantage, but there's no hiding place. And that's for me, that's a great thing. But Darren, over to you. And I know Darren, Paul has really given a thorough answer. But can you add anything for your own self? What's effectively an effectively learning loop? And what gets in the way of that in your environments?
Yeah. I think Paul's used some fantastic words. Scribbled a bunch down here. Use the word design. And that's a really intentional way to approach, some of this feedback during practice is slightly a different concept. The design process is something I'm really in terms of I think feedback follows three principles. I think you need to have really clear aims for your feedback. So again, Paul's touched on that, exactly what's the aim of this piece of feedback? What's the aim of this intervention or feedback strategy that we're looking to implement? And you have to bring the players into that. And again, I'm really interested I'd love to be a fly on the wall in Paul's environment and see the players deliver that back and then hear their experience of receiving information from the coaching team. So I believe you have to have aims. They have to be clear. They have to be shared. Then you have to design your content in a way that's geared towards establishing your aims. Okay, so we're designing content which has concurrent decisions happening all the time, but that's all about designing an intervention that helps people reach the aims that you share with them. And then I think you have to have some evaluation strategies. And again, Paul's got some there which are really kind of interesting, and I'd love to hear more about those at some point. But you have to have a method for evaluating your feedback intervention, and that might be the athlete's experience of what they've been involved in. It might be your own reflection on your delivery. Did the intervention go to plan? Did we get close to our aims? But I think those are the things that I would consider as part of a loop, because ultimately your evaluation process gives you your next set of aims. But what we know about performance is there's so many things to look at that ultimately your aims get shifted every time your players take the field or there's a game. So it becomes a management process in all that as well, because you could feedback on everything. So yeah, that's what I would say. You need to have clear and shared aims. You need to design an intervention and content for your intervention or strategy that drives people closer towards your intended aims. And then you need to decide how you evaluate that, whether it's a self-evaluation, external evaluation. So yeah, that's kind of how I'd share
No,
it.
it's really good, Darren. And listen, I've actually really like the way you've structured it. I'm interested about that content design you're talking about. I'd love to hear more about that. But now is a question, and I put Paul on the spot. What gets in the way of it in your environment, or does anything?
No, I think performance gets in the way of feedback, because ultimately, what happens when we perform is it either alters our view of what we thought we'd be feeding back on because our aims weren't met, or we met our aims, but aims come up. And something else when you diagnose source. Um, so performance is one thing. The other thing I would think is kind of people's an intention to think about things as we've spoken about them for the last hour. And again, performance and programs and timing gets in the way of all those things, because to do lots of the things we've been speaking about here, shape environments, shape athletes' understanding, shape our own understanding, and evolve those things takes an awful amount of time. And I'm sure, as Paul can attest to, when we talk about performance sport, there's no time. So we really have to prioritize those things. But I think it's happening more and more. I think there's, Jason does a level of awareness, raised a level of awareness to different things that, I'm going to have to start Googling now, Bloom's taxonomy and things like that. So, yeah, there's a whole bunch of things that can get in the way of that.
Darren, listen, and the first one, your first response, performance gets in the way of feedback. I'm sorry, I'm stealing that because I think no, I think it's probably one of the most truest things I've ever heard about feedback, that performance. Because and one of the things that we always say, I've seen in my own experience, is that feedback, there seems to be more feedback given after a loss rather than after we've won. You'll get the pat in the back, well done, we'll all go in and celebrate. But when after a loss, I always see it, and I've seen it in environments that I've worked in as well, that you see that, what, on the next session we do around analysis is going to be the one that we're really focused on. And I've just seen the clear difference, and it's just really, it really resonated with me. So thanks for that. And Paul and Jason, I haven't forgotten about you, but hearing from you two practitioners in that, for I'm sure for our audience, because we're nearly closing up now, it's just wonderful to hear that, and it's so refreshing. It's actually given me own some ideas that I'm actually going to borrow, steal, whatever you want to call it. I'm taking them. But Jason, I want you to close this out. Just from after hearing Paul and hearing Darren and hearing everything that's been spoken about, why do some environments, in your opinion, take feedback and turn it into consistent behavioural shift and change, while others probably just hear the same information week after week and nothing happens?
I think it's an element of all the above, what we've been talking about to a degree. It's about that environment and what are we creating? Are we creating information, or are we creating learning? And that's what that was the conversations I had with Paul for a period in the coaches, was let's stop thinking about information and let's see how we turn this into a learning experience, and what does that look like. So we got into the science of learning, and just understood that. So to me, really a lot of it comes down to the leadership, is the people in that environment and the skills that they have to understand whether learning's happening, because these people in a lot of environments are exceptionally high level coaches. They've achieved stuff I could only ever dream of in an environment. So when I'm coming with some concepts, new concepts and new things, I'm talking to people like Paul, who's won a World Series and 14 odd tournaments at that level, and I'm just trying to my approach is, I'm not coming to change all your traditions. I'm not coming here to say all the coaching that you've done before, all the coaching courses you've done before were wrong or ever are wrong, and even are wrong at this moment. That's not what it's about. What I'm saying is the stuff that I have adds on to that. It's just a plug-in. It's just something to tweak all that learning that you've already done, that'll just add. I think of it like a jigsaw. I'm just one piece of that jigsaw. And you've all these other coaching programs that you've done. If I can add a piece that elevates. So it's about those leadership teams going and saying, I think Paul said it very well, we're asking different questions now. And it's getting to that stage of our coaches asking better and different questions. And I think for me, when you get specific to feedback, I always used to think of feedback, and we heard these, was it verbal, was it this? And I can remember doing my masters, and I read one of the pieces of research or books I had to read was a book by B.F. Skinner called Verbal Behaviour. Now, I wouldn't recommend anybody goes and reads it, because this thing is the most complex technical read I have ever read in my life. I think it took me I had to read every chapter about 3 times just to understand what he was saying. But literally what he was talking about was that everything's verbal. It's just a verbal operant of some sort. So what he was saying, like a sign, is that he called it a demand. It's demanding something on me. It's verbally telling me to do something. And so then I started to think about what feedback looks like. So like when we were talking earlier about those numbers, put them in the wrong context, into the wrong hands. That's feedback. That's verbally telling that player to do something. That's verbally telling that coach to do something. So it's how you control that environment, how you set that environment to know what to do with all these different sources of information. We're living in this world at the moment with the amount of information is on tap. It's unbelievable. And, it's nearly like a coach could be saying one thing, but then they watch a video on YouTube or something that is saying something totally different. And they start, so you're competing for a bit of space in this person's head. So it's about creating that environment. It's about creating a chain of custody for your content, for your feedback. Who needs what, when do they need it, and who should be reacting to it, and having those conversations with all those people in that environment to say, look, if Johnny comes up to you and starts talking about data, ignore him. That's not his spot. That you shouldn't be talking about. You know what I mean? You shouldn't be feeding that back, because that's not what we need. So it's about understanding the chain of custody of information within our environment. Because when you fine tune that and you get your people to react to only the information that is valuable to them, the information that they should be getting or should be coming, tapered down from your head coach and pushed out and disseminated that way. If we manage that information, that feedback in that environment, you start to get the outcomes that you want. It's the competing information, a changing, and that competing information is misinterpretation of information. It's ambiguity in the information and that sort of stuff. So it's about building that environment of good clarity, good data when it's needed, only given to the people that need it, and those sorts of things. And start thinking about unintended consequences. Start thinking about, if I throw all this information at this person, how much of it they're going to remember? How much do I expect them to remember? And those sorts of things. So yeah, it's feedback is all the above. And I think this is the thing. We start to talk about feedback as like this thing that happens at the end of something, when it's happening during, it's happening before, it's always happening. And it's how we get people to learn to I suppose, manage this feedback within. So I talk about metacognition. How do they know in their own head? I know what I know what I don't know, but I know how to get the information to fill the gap between the two, and things like that. And it's getting people to start to want to do that for themselves as well.
Jason, Paul, and Darren. Jason, thank you for that. Folks, I'm going to open up the floor. That's essentially the three guests have finished. I have no more to ask of them. I will give a bit of a recap at the end, but I'm going to leave this up to anyone left. Have you any questions for the panel about what we've just spoken about for the last hour? You can put them in the chat, or Jason, can we get them brought in to ask a question if they have one?
It depends if they see the function on the type of app that they're using to access the webinar. If they see a function of like a dialing, I think they can try and dial in, or they can just put it in the chat.
So folks, give you an option there, stick it in the chat, or can we dial in with it if you want to ask your question verbally. I don't want me to be the one asking the only questions, but I will allow a few more seconds, folks, because that talk was really fascinating, folks. If you have any, as an athlete, a former athlete, now show me age, and as a practitioner in elite sport, I think one of the questions now I'm going to ask myself now, we talked about pressure, not in any order. We talked about the environment, and we talked about feedback, things that I've always heard a lot about pressure, especially pressure and feedback. But one thing that I've never been consciously aware, I've always had an idea, and if I was asked about it, I would then give off chapter and verse. But I think a lot of practitioners that I've seen or worked under, and I'm myself included in this, is a more conscious approach and careful consideration to that environment. Because at the end of the day, it is about the players. And if that bit's not right, then anything else doesn't even matter, is what I would take from that, folks. And it's really fascinating to hear how it's applied, Paul, from you in that top level of, like, especially sevens rugby. Like, we know how intense that game can be. We know how physical it can be, and we know the level of athlete that you're just going to be working with. Darren, the same. You've worked in a rugby background, and now you've switched, and you're now giving that knowledge to different sports. Again, I think your job probably, and I don't want to be disparaging here to Paul or anyone else, is probably more difficult, especially because you could be working with more different types of sports, and therefore you have to brush up on probably subject knowledge more than around more sports. For example, I'm not sure, would you probably know as much about ice hockey as you do as rugby, because you've been working in rugby for years. So my hat's off to you on that one. And then Jason, tying it together and looking at it from a different standpoint, and even as Paul said, even myself around Bloom's taxonomy, about level of thinking skills. And maybe I have to go back and reflect, not just about sport, about what way do I think as an individual. But my mind is blown tonight, folks. I've lots of notes written down that I'm now going to have to formulate into longer sentences, and now to think about my own behaviour from my standpoint. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful experience for me, and I'm actually glad that you give me the opportunity to moderate this and hopefully direct you. Although I didn't have as much time as I'd like, because there's just lots more conversations we could have there. But for the audience at home, that was a great flavour. Darren, Paul, and Jason, thank you very much.